Annie Rivas arrived 5 minutes late to the interview that could change her life. In a firm like Ibáñez and Arena's attorneys, that was almost a death sentence. She walked in with her hair tangled from the Madrid wind, a folder pressed against her chest, and an apology so long that the head of human resources stopped taking notes before she even finished. Adrián Ibáñez watched her from across the table without moving a muscle. He was serious, structured, impeccable, the kind of man who never needed to raise his voice to command respect. And Annie, in under a minute, had already done everything she wasn't supposed to do. She arrived late, got tangled in her scarf, knocked a pen onto the floor, made a nervous joke, and smiled like she'd just thrown open a window in a room that had been sealed shut for too long. Human resources thought she was finished. But 30 minutes later, when Annie walked out convinced she'd ruined her chance, Adrián closed her resume folder and wrote just 3 words: hired. Notify HR. Nobody understood it. Not HR, not Marcus, his business partner and best friend, and not even Adrián himself, because he didn't yet realize he hadn't just chosen an assistant. He had just hired the only woman capable of opening the locked trunk where he'd been hiding his heart for years. But to really understand how they got to that moment, you first need to know this law firm, its partners, its silences, and the problem of the empty chair outside Adrián's office. The firm of Ibáñez and Arenas occupied the second floor of a stone building in Madrid's Salamanca district. From the street, the bronze sign above the door was discreet, almost cold, but that discretion was itself a statement. We don't need to advertise. People come looking for us. Inside, the place was exactly what it promised. Dark wood, natural light filtered through blinds nobody ever fully opened, a working silence broken only by the click of keyboards, the murmur of hushed phone calls, and the particular sound of someone who knows exactly where they're going as they walk down a hallway. Adrián Ibáñez walked like that, with the kind of confidence that doesn't need to prove anything, because it's already there, woven into the way he stepped, held a folder, looked at someone when he spoke. 38 years old, founding partner, a specialist in corporate law and in the fine art of getting a difficult client to sign exactly where he needed them to, without ever feeling pressured. Tall, strong jawline, an intense gaze that, depending on the day and the person across from him, could read as authority or as a question. Always impeccable, never a wrinkle in his suit that he hadn't chosen himself. His partner, Marcus Arenas, was the opposite in every way and exactly the same underneath. Marcus was 39, 6'2" of reckless charm, with a specific talent for making sure that any meeting, dinner, or elevator conversation ended with everyone looking at him. He was the lawyer who closed a deal over a glass of wine that Adrián would have needed a 40-page contract to seal. Single by choice, brilliant by nature, a charming disaster nobody could quite manage to hate. And Marta Villanueva, 55 years old, was the reason the charming disaster actually worked. Marta had spent 12 years as Marcus's personal assistant, which, in practice, meant managing his calendar, anticipating his crises, buying gifts for women whose names he mixed up, booking restaurants for apologies he didn't even know he owed, and keeping an updated, color-coded spreadsheet with filters titled Marcus's Women, Birthdays, Allergies, and Emotional Danger Level. She didn't talk much. She watched. And when she spoke, it was to say exactly what needed to be said. She'd been at the firm so long she was practically part of the architecture. The problem that Monday morning in October was the empty chair outside Adrián's office. His assistant, 12 years of quiet efficiency, a flawless filing system, and a memory for detail he'd never once acknowledged out loud, but absolutely depended on, had gotten married 3 weeks earlier to a man who'd received a job offer in Amsterdam. And she had gone with him to Amsterdam. Adrián had handled it with the same expression he handled everything, no visible reaction. But for 3 weeks now, he hadn't been able to find a single file. The wrong coffee kept showing up on his desk because nobody remembered he took it black, no sugar, and he'd been answering calls himself that used to never even reach his phone. Marcus appeared in his doorway that morning with a cup of coffee and a smile that promised nothing good. HR has 8 candidates lined up for this afternoon's interview. He paused. Do I need to remind you that you're the one conducting it? Or do you already have that under control? I have it under control, Adrián said, without looking up from the document. Perfect. Marcus walked in uninvited, sat down across from the desk, and crossed his arms. Listen, Adrián, I've been thinking. That's new. Very funny. Hear me out. What if Marta just moved over to work with you? Her whole system is exactly what you need. Organized, discreet, efficient, never late. Marta is perfect. Adrián finally looked up. That's exactly why she needs to stay with you. Without Marta, you're a traffic accident in an expensive suit. Marcus opened his mouth, closed it, considered the comment. That's completely true, he admitted. But that's a serious lack of solidarity, Adrián. Solidarity isn't a legal concept. He went back to the document. I'm interviewing this afternoon. You don't need to be there. I wasn't planning to be. Marcus stood up. But I do plan to find out how it went. For informational purposes. Adrián didn't answer. Marcus walked out. And in the hallway, Marta watched him pass with the expression of someone who already knew exactly how this was going to end, and had absolutely no intention of telling anyone. For the record, Adrián had spent the last 3 weeks telling himself that what he needed was efficiency, organization, a system, someone like Marta. What he was about to get was something completely different. And the most interesting part was that, for quite a while, he wasn't going to admit that either. Adrián walked into the conference room at exactly 5 o'clock. On the table sat the resume of the day's final candidate, a bottle of mineral water, and the pen he always used to take notes, even though he never ended up looking at them afterward. He'd interviewed 7 people that afternoon. 7. All competent, some brilliant. One had a master's degree in executive management and spoke 5 languages. Another had been an assistant to a government minister. Each resume had more lines on it than his own had when he graduated from law school. It wasn't that they lacked anything specific. It was that they had too much of something he couldn't quite name, and which, therefore, he couldn't exactly ask HR to filter for. A certain rigidity. A certain, I know precisely how I'm supposed to behave in this room, posture that bored him before they'd even finished their first sentence. It was 5:05 when the door opened. The girl walked in with her hair windswept from the October wind, a folder under her arm, her scarf half undone, and an expression that mixed genuine apology with barely contained panic. She was, objectively, the most beautiful person who had walked through that door all day, maybe all month. Long hair in golden waves, eyes with that kind of warmth you can't fake. But that's not what stopped him. What stopped him was that before she'd even sat down, she was already talking. I'm so sorry, I'm not usually late. I mean, today, obviously, yes, but as a personal identity, I am not a late person. The metro switched lines at Serrano and well, that doesn't matter. What matters is that I'm here. I completely understand that 5 minutes late is 5 minutes late, and that it says something about a person, even if that person isn't normally like this. Are you finished? Adrián asked. A pause. I think so. Although under pressure, I can get worse. He didn't smile, but he looked down at the resume to hide that it had amused him, a small, quick flicker that was gone before he looked back up. Sit down, Miss Rivas. Annie Rivas. She sat down, adjusted the folder, realized her scarf was still half on, and pulled it off with a motion that knocked the pen off the desk. She picked it up, handed it back. Thank you. Sorry. This isn't representative of how I normally am. And how are you normally? Significantly more coordinated. And with less scarf. Adrián looked at her. She looked at him. And in that moment, something in his eyes, that calm intensity, that particular weight, made Annie Rivas, who had survived 7 interviews in Madrid without once getting genuinely nervous, feel heat rise to her cheeks. Which made her more nervous. Which, in turn, made her do exactly what she did when she got nervous. You know what my mother told me when I left Vigo? She said that in Madrid, people are late to everything except what actually matters. So technically, you could argue that being late to this interview is a sign that it matters to me a lot. Silence. That's the most creative thing I've heard all day, Adrián said. It works. I didn't say that. She smiled. It was a smile that lit something up in the room, like someone had quietly turned up the lights. But it was worth a try. Adrián went back to the resume, and if anyone had been watching him in that moment, which no one was, since they were alone, they would have noticed it took him 1 second longer than necessary to speak again. Why do you want to work here? Because I want to learn from excellent people. She said it directly, without hesitation. And because I need to prove to myself that I can live in a big city without calling my mother every time the metro changes lines. Adrián blinked, just once, but it was noticeable. How long have you been in Madrid? 3 months. I'm from a small town near Vigo, Galicia. A pause. You already know that. It's on the resume. I know. I wanted to hear how you say it. Annie looked at him with more attention, as if recalibrating something. I say it with pride, and with just enough fear to keep me sharp. I think that's the right combination. Adrián asked the hard questions, the same ones he'd asked 7 times that afternoon, about crisis management, confidentiality, how she'd handle a conflict between scheduling and a real emergency. Annie didn't have the experience the other candidates had, but she answered honestly, with an instinct that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than training. And when she didn't know something, she said so. I don't know that, but I'd learn, without over-apologizing or padding the answer. The last question was one that wasn't even in his notes. What would you do if I asked you to do something you thought was wrong? Annie didn't hesitate for even 2 seconds. I'd tell you. Respectfully, but I'd tell you. A brief pause. That's a problem. No, Adrián said. That's an answer. The interview lasted 42 minutes, twice as long as any other that day. When Annie walked out of the room, the head of HR looked at her with the expression of someone who'd spent the whole afternoon bracing for the worst. How did it go? Good, Annie said, trying not to let it show that her heart was beating faster than normal. I think it went well. Inside, Adrián sat looking at the resume, name, last name, date of birth, education, a single line of prior work experience that wouldn't have impressed anyone in that room. He wrote 3 words on the file, hired, notify HR, and closed the folder. HR hadn't expected it. Neither had Marcus. And Adrián, if he'd been completely honest with himself in that moment, which he was not, hadn't expected it either. The call from HR came the next morning at 9. Miss Rivas, we're pleased to inform you that you've been selected for the position of personal assistant to Mr. Ibáñez. You can start next Monday. Annie was silent for 5 seconds. I, Adrián Ibáñez, the serious man with the intense eyes. Mr. Ibáñez. Yes. Another silence. All right. I'll be there Monday. Across the city, in the Salamanca office, Marcus burst into Adrián's office holding the selection file, his expression somewhere between genuine confusion and anticipated delight. Adrián. You picked her? Yes. The girl who showed up late, got tangled in her scarf, and threw a pen on the floor. Does she have potential? Potential for what, exactly? For learning. For growing. For doing the job well. Adrián didn't look up. Is there anything else? Marcus stared at him for a moment that stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. No, he said finally. Nothing else. He walked out, and in the hallway, he stopped by Marta's desk. Did you know he was going to pick her? He asked quietly. Marta looked up from her screen, just enough. I don't know anything, Mr. Marcus. I just take notes. You never just take notes. She went back to the screen without answering. But at the corner of her mouth, there was something that on anyone else might have been called a smile. Annie arrived Monday at 8:58, 2 minutes early, which, given the circumstances of the interview, felt like a personal victory that no one else could fully appreciate. The office had a different energy that early, calmer. Madrid's noise hadn't fully crept in yet. Marta was already at her desk with a cup of tea and 3 folders open at once, and she watched Annie walk in with the expression of someone evaluating without letting it show. Miss Rivas. I'm Marta. Your desk is over there. She nodded toward it. Mr. Ibáñez arrives at 9. Black coffee, no sugar. The coffee machine is in the back, on the right. The filing system has its own logic. I'll explain it after the coffee. Understood. Annie set down her bag, looked at the desk, looked at Marta. Is there anything I should know before he gets here? Marta considered the question for a moment. Mr. Adrián isn't difficult, she said finally. He's sad. It's not the same thing. Annie blinked. The coffee, Miss Rivas. Adrián arrived at 9:02. He saw Annie at her desk, back to him, trying to decipher the folder labeling system with the concentration of someone defusing a bomb. He left his briefcase in his office without saying anything. A moment later, he came back out. Good morning. Annie spun around, standing up faster than necessary, with so much energy that the pen in her hand went flying and landed half a meter from Adrián's shoes. They both looked at it, then at each other. I'm going to get a leash for these, Annie said, pointing at the pen, completely serious. Adrián picked it up off the floor and handed it back. Good morning, he said simply. Your coffee is on your desk. Black, No sugar. And the filing system, I still don't fully understand it, but Marta says it has its own logic, so I'll assume it does, and I'll figure it out. A pause. Good morning. You already said that. I know. I repeat myself when I'm nervous. He looked at her for exactly 1 second, took his coffee, walked into his office, and closed the door with a softness that, in any other man, wouldn't have meant anything, but in Adrián Ibáñez, meant he'd allowed himself something. The first few days were an exercise in mutual adjustment that neither of them would have described that way. On Tuesday, Annie brought Adrián the wrong file to a meeting and only discovered it once they were already inside. The client asked about the Herrera contract, and she opened the folder to find a confidentiality agreement from a completely different case. She froze for 2 full seconds, then looked up at Adrián with the expression of someone calculating whether they could jump out the window. Adrián took the folder, closed it calmly, and told the client they'd review that particular document at the end of the meeting, since a last-minute detail needed clarifying first. The client nodded. The meeting continued. Nobody died. Afterward, in the hallway, Annie waited for him, looking like someone awaiting sentencing. I know what you're going to say. That I'm a disaster. That hiring me was probably a mistake. That next time I should check the folder before walking in. A pause. That's everything. Annie blinked. You're not going to scold me? Is it going to happen again? No. Never. In my life. Then there's nothing to scold. And he walked into his office. Annie stood there staring at the closed door with the expression of someone who'd just witnessed something they hadn't expected and didn't quite know how to process. At her desk, Marta kept typing without looking up. Surprised? She said. A little. A pause. I told you. He's not difficult. Another pause. He's sad. Wednesday was the phone system incident. Annie transferred an important client's call directly to Marcus's cell phone, at a moment when Marcus was on a personal date, and answered in a tone that very clearly was not his office voice. The client was offended. Marcus had to call back with his best professional tone. Marta had to draft an apology, and Annie spent the afternoon the color of Galician roses in July. When she went to apologize to Adrián, he raised a hand before she could finish. Did you already talk to Marta about the phone system? Yes. I know how to use it now. Good. A pause. And I also know how to use it backward, just in case. She said it completely seriously. Adrián looked at her for a moment. Something crossed his face that didn't quite become a smile, but lived in the same neighborhood. Good, he said, and went back to his documents. Adrián's patience with Annie's mistakes became, over the course of that first week, an unofficial topic of conversation around the office. The head of HR mentioned it to a coworker. One of the firm's lawyers brought it up over coffee. And Marcus Arenas, who had a finely tuned radar for anomalies in his business partner's behavior, filed it away mentally, underlined, as something worth keeping an eye on. Because Adrián Ibáñez did not have patience. Or rather, he had plenty of patience for difficult cases, complicated clients, slow judges, but for avoidable mistakes in his own office, his own system, his own routine, he had none. He was a man of very specific standards, and he communicated that with a single look. And yet, with Annie, the look was different. It wasn't the look of patience. It was something else. On the Thursday of that first week, Marcus walked into Adrián's office under the pretext of asking about a case, and found his partner staring through the glass wall that looked out onto the open work area. Annie was at her desk, trying to organize a filing cabinet with the expression of someone solving a Rubik's Cube in a foreign language. Half its contents spilled onto the floor. She picked everything up, put it back, and it fell again. She looked at the ceiling for a second, clearly asking the universe for something, and started over. Adrián was watching her with an expression Marcus, in 12 years of friendship, had never seen on his face. Adrián turned around like someone who'd just been caught doing something. What? Nothing. Marcus set the folder down on the desk. The question can wait. And he left. In the hallway, he stopped by Marta's desk, arms crossed. Marta, how long has this been going on? Marta didn't look up. Since the interview, by my estimate. Oh my God, yes. And her. A very brief pause. Miss Rivas, Marta said carefully, is a very intelligent young woman who is doing everything she can not to notice what she's noticing. Marcus stood in the hallway for a moment. This is going to be very interesting. Or very complicated, Marta said. Sometimes that's the same thing. What Marcus had seen from the doorway was only half the scene. The other half was this. When Adrián turned back to his documents and Annie looked up from her desk, sometimes their eyes met through the glass. And when that happened, Annie looked down first, always with a quick movement that fooled absolutely no one who happened to be paying attention. And Adrián noticed and went back to his documents. And there was something about that repeating cycle, look, get caught looking, look away, look again, that had the structure of a conversation neither of them was having out loud, but that both of them were having with perfect clarity. The following week, Marcus Arenas walked into the partners area with the specific energy of someone coming to snoop while pretending to come to work. He stopped by Annie's desk with a smile she, newly arrived from Vigo, hadn't yet learned to fully decode. You must be Annie. He wasn't asking, he was confirming. Marcus Arenas. Partner. The fun one. Right. Annie smiled. Marta told me about you. In what terms? Favorable. With caveats. Marcus laughed, a genuine laugh, the kind you can't fake. And as he looked at her, with that ease he had for reading people, he thought that Adrián had better taste than he usually got credit for. I like her, he said to no one in particular. Like what? Annie asked. Nothing. Welcome to the firm. And he headed toward the hallway, the smile still on his face. From his office, through the glass, Adrián had watched the whole conversation. He hadn't heard a word, but he'd seen Marcus smile at Annie that specific way Marcus smiled at people he found interesting, and he'd looked back down at his documents with a sudden, unjustified intensity of concentration, given that he'd been staring at the same page for 10 minutes. That afternoon, Marcus stopped in Adrián's doorway. Your assistant is charming. She's efficient. She's also charming. I didn't hire her to be charming. What a specific thing to say for someone who isn't jealous. Adrián looked up. Marcus was already walking away. 2 days later, Annie discovered the spreadsheet. She'd been looking for a phone number on the shared administrative computer and found it by accident. Marcus's women, birthdays, allergies, and emotional danger level, color-coded, with filters, including a column labeled Current Status and another labeled Contingency Plan. She went to find Marta. Is this real? Marta didn't look up. One learns to prevent fires. Emotional danger level. Some people can handle a breakup with grace. Some people show up at the office crying. The column is preventative. A pause. And if he ever asks about the spreadsheet, he doesn't know it exists. Another pause. Nobody knows it exists except you now. And that was my mistake. Forget it. Forgotten. Annie nodded with the seriousness of someone signing an NDA. Can I ask you something else, Marta? Has Mr. Ibáñez always been like this, so guarded? Marta stopped typing for the first time in the conversation. She looked at Annie. Not always, she said, and went back to the screen. But 2 years ago, something changed. And ever since, yes. Annie went back to her desk, and on the way, thought that this office was definitely more interesting than she'd expected. 3 weeks after she started, Annie understood exactly why Adrián Ibáñez had the reputation he had. The client's name was Fermin Laria, the owner of a mid-sized distribution company, 62 years old, who had walked into the office in his most expensive suit with the tightest jaw of his life. He had a contract dispute with a business partner who, according to him, had betrayed him. He wanted to win. He kept using that exact word, win. The meeting had been going 40 minutes. Adrián laid out the legal strategy with his usual precision, facts, timelines, probabilities, everything solid, everything correct. And the client wasn't calming down. He kept shouting quietly, the way men shout when they know they shouldn't be shouting, about the betrayal, the years he'd invested, what he deserved after all that time. Annie was outside. She had no reason to be in the room and no access to it. But she'd been listening to the voice leaking through the door for 10 minutes, watching the man's face every time the meeting paused, and he stepped out for water. She grabbed a post-it, wrote 4 words, and slipped it under the door to the assistant inside, with instructions to pass it to Adrián discreetly. The note read, he doesn't want to win. He wants an apology. Adrián read it, folded it, put it in his pocket, and in the next 3 minutes, did something nobody in that room expected. He lowered his tone, acknowledged the client's emotional pain, not as a legal matter, but as a human one, and told him the firm understood this was about more than a contract. The man stopped talking for the first time in 40 minutes. The meeting ended well. The client signed the extension, thanked everyone, and left with a completely different posture than the one he'd walked in with. The moment the room emptied, Adrián went to find Annie. How did you know that? She shrugged, and there was something in that gesture more honest than any prepared answer. He was shouting too much for someone who just wanted money. When people shout like that, it's because something hurt them first. A pause. I had a boyfriend once who rejected me in front of his friends, and I did exactly that. Shouted about things that weren't the real problem, because the real problem was that it hurt, and I didn't know how to say so. Adrián looked at her. It was the kind of look that lasts 1 second longer than a professional look between a boss and his assistant should. I don't understand how a man could do that to you. He said it before he could stop himself. He knew it the moment the words left his mouth. He knew it from the silence that followed, from the way Annie looked up at him with a new expression that wasn't quite surprise, but something closer to very still attention. Adrián picked up the folder from the table. Well done, he said, in a perfectly normal voice that referred to none of what had just happened. Thanks, Annie answered, in an equally normal, equally false voice. And each of them went back to work. But something had changed, or rather, something had become visible that had been waiting weeks for someone to name it. It was a Tuesday morning when Marcus walked into Adrián's office with what he called an HR resource optimization proposal, which Adrián identified within 4 seconds as something else entirely. HR raised the idea of doing assistant rotations. Marcus sat down, uninvited, as always. The idea is that partners and assistants get exposed to different working styles. More operational flexibility. Marta with you for 3 weeks. Annie with me. He spread his hands. Makes sense from an operational standpoint. No, Adrián said. Marcus blinked. No what? No. It's not practical. Why not? Why is Annie learning my system? Your system or your moods? Silence. Marcus. Oh, we're using my first name as a threat now. Progress. Adrián gave him the look that, in court, made witnesses suddenly remember things they'd claimed to forget. The rotation isn't happening. If HR insists, I'll talk to them myself. Anything else? Marcus stood slowly, looking down at him, the only position from which he ever had the advantage over Adrián Ibáñez. No, he said. Nothing else. He walked into the hallway, where Marta sat at her desk. He stopped in front of her, arms crossed. Adrián is in love with his assistant. Marta didn't look up. Mr. Marcus, I don't speculate about the partners' personal lives. Marta, I've known since week 2. The coffee gave it away. The coffee. He used to order black coffee. Now he asks whether Miss Rivas has had lunch yet. A brief pause. Those are different things. Marcus stood in the hallway for a moment. And Annie? Marta considered the question carefully, as she considered everything. Miss Rivas, she said, looks away every time he looks at her for too long. And there are people who look away because something makes them uncomfortable. And there are people who look away because something matters too much to keep looking at. And she's the second. Marcus nodded slowly. I'm going to enjoy the next few months a great deal. I imagine you will. Marta turned the page. You have a meeting in 10 minutes, Mr. Marcus. For the record, Marcus Arenas stopped trying to win over Annie Rivas at exactly that moment. Not because he didn't find her charming. He did, without question, but because there was something far more interesting at stake. Watching Adrián Ibáñez, the most controlled man in Madrid, lose control. That, to Marcus, was priceless. And also, because underneath it all, he was a good friend, even if he hid it well. The excuse was the Villanueva case, no relation to Marta. Just another Villanueva, a contract negotiation with a hearing in 10 days, which Adrián wanted to go over carefully before the file got any more complicated than it already was. It was 7:30 in the evening, and the rest of the office had gone home. Annie sat at her computer with the file open and her 3rd cup of tea of the afternoon when Adrián stepped out of his office. Have you eaten? She looked at him. It was such an unexpected question coming from him that it took her a second to even register it as a question. No, I wasn't going to ask for anything else. There's a restaurant on the corner of Velázquez. We could go over the Villanueva case there. A pause. If that works for you. Sure, Annie said. And as she put the file away, she wondered whether, if that works for you, was just how Adrián Ibáñez phrased things, or whether it was how he phrased specific things. The restaurant was small, white tablecloths, warm lighting, the kind of place that never feels loud even when it's full. Adrián ordered without looking at the menu. Annie ordered whatever sounded like something her mother would have approved of. The first 20 minutes were about the Villanueva case. Then the conversation drifted, not suddenly, but with that slow pull that things have when they move on their own and nobody's watching. Annie talked about Vigo, about her mother, about the first time she'd arrived in Madrid with one big suitcase, and the feeling that the city was a living thing that hadn't invited her in, about how the metro still disoriented her if it switched lines without warning. "Do you call your mother when that happens?" Adrián asked. "Only when it's the Chimberry line specifically. That one has something personal against me." A pause. "Although I've gotten better. I used to call my mother and also sit on the platform waiting for someone who looked local to explain what had happened. And once, someone actually stopped to explain it. A woman, about 70, told me the Madrid metro is like difficult men. You don't try to understand them, you just figure out which direction they're going." Adrián stared at her. "And what did you say to that?" "That it was the most useful thing anyone had told me since I got to this city." He laughed, small, brief, genuine. Annie stared at him with the expression of someone who'd just seen something they hadn't expected. "You laugh. Occasionally. You should put that on your resume. It's a surprise." Adrián looked at her from across the table, not with the look of a boss, not with the look of someone evaluating her, but with something harder to name. "Do you like Madrid?" "I'm starting to like it more." She said it looking at the wine in her glass. "At first it felt too fast, like everyone already knew where they were going, and I was the only one reading the map upside down. But I think that passes." "It passes," he confirmed. There was a silence, the kind that doesn't feel awkward. "Are you from Madrid?" she asked. "Salamanca. The neighborhood, not the city." "And did you like it when you first came here?" Adrián took a second longer than usual. "At first, yes. Then I had reasons to stay that were more complicated." A pause. "And then those reasons stopped existing, and I stayed anyway." Annie didn't ask anything more. She understood, without needing the full answer. They left the restaurant past 10. The October night was cold and clear. They walked half a block together until the path split, him toward the parking garage, her toward the metro. They stopped. "Good night, Annie." "Good night." He started to turn, but before he did, and she never knew if it was the wind, or instinct, or the way the streetlight fell on her hair, he reached up and brushed back a strand that had blown across her face. He did it slowly, and stayed too close. 2 seconds, maybe 3, long enough for both of them to know exactly what was happening, and for neither of them to say it. Adrián lowered his hand. "Good night," he said again, and walked away. Annie stood on the sidewalk for a moment she couldn't have measured. Then she pulled her phone from her bag and called her mother. "Mom, the metro didn't change lines. I just wanted to talk." Inés Valcárcel was 41, ran an investment firm with 3 offices across Europe, and had the kind of presence that comes from years of knowing exactly what effect you have when you walk into a room. She arrived at the office on a Thursday morning for a meeting about restructuring a partnership agreement, well-dressed, subtly perfumed, direct gaze. When Adrián greeted her in the conference room, she looked at him in a way that had nothing to do with corporate law. "I wonder," she said, "if you ever lose control." He answered with a professional formula. But Annie, who was making coffee at the little station down the hall with the door half open, heard the line, and something in her made an almost imperceptible shift that, if she could have named it, she would have called disapproval. She brought in the coffee, served it, left. For minutes later, she came back with water. "In case you need it." Adrián glanced at her, one eyebrow barely raised. 6 minutes later, she returned with a pen. "In case you need to take additional notes." Inés looked at her with curiosity. Adrián, with something closer to controlled disbelief. 9 minutes after that, Annie reappeared with a small tray of cookies. "In case the meeting runs long and someone needs to keep their blood sugar up." Inés Valcárcel smiled, a smile that knew a great deal. "Your assistant is very attentive." "Extremely," Annie said, with a smile that was trying to be professional and was objectively far too wide for the context. "I'm very dedicated to my work." Adrián held her gaze for exactly 1 second. She laughed, and for the first time in a long time, he had to make an active effort not to smile in the middle of a business meeting. When Inés Valcárcel left, Adrián called Annie into his office. "You came in 5 times. 6. If you count the sugar one." "We didn't need sugar." She seemed very bitter. Adrián looked at her. Annie held his gaze with an innocence that wasn't entirely innocent. "Annie, don't interrupt a client meeting again for non-professional reasons." "With all due respect, I don't know what you mean. My reasons were entirely professional." The client needed hydration, writing implements, and glucose to perform well. That's resource management. Adrián looked at her for a moment. Resource management. Exactly. You came in with cookies. Cookies are resources. Silence. Adrián leaned back slightly in his chair. Annie held her position with admirable conviction, despite knowing, internally, that she was losing this argument. And the pen, he said. There were 3 already on the table. A spare pen never hurts. Contracts are long. Annie. Mr. Ibáñez. Were you jealous? The question landed directly, no warning. Annie opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. I was being proactive. With the resources. Understood. A silence that lasted exactly long enough for both of them to know perfectly well what wasn't being said. Can I ask you something? Annie said, in a voice steadier than she expected. Go ahead. Did it bother you that I kept coming in? Adrián took a second. No, he said. And it was a one-word answer that contained several things neither of them was ready to name yet. That's all, Annie. She nodded, turned to leave, and at the door, almost without meaning to, turned back. Next time, I'll only come in 4 times. As a compromise. Adrián didn't answer, but when the door closed, the look on his face was that of someone winning something he hadn't expected to win. In the hallway, Annie walked past Marta's desk without stopping. Not a word. Marta looked up. I didn't say anything, sweetheart. Mentally, she made a note. Miss Rivas has clear feelings. Mr. Ibáñez has clear feelings. The problem is that both of them are acting like feelings are a file you can just close and put away. Spoiler, you can't. The Herrero negotiation lasted 11 hours. It was the kind of case that gives you no breathing room. A merger contract with a termination clause that the other side was interpreting very conveniently, and which Adrián had spent 2 weeks dismantling, argument by argument. That night, at 9, they were alone in the office. Everyone else had gone home. Madrid pulsed on, indifferent, outside. When the client signed off on the favorable extension over the phone and Adrián hung up, Annie dropped the pen she'd been gripping for the last hour and leaned back in her chair with the relief of someone who'd just survived something. We did it. You did it, Adrián said. He was standing by the window, tie loosened, looking out at the street. No, the strategy was yours. I just saw what I wasn't seeing. He turned around, looked at her. That's not just anything. Annie looked at him from her chair. There was something different about him that night. Maybe it was the hour, or the exhaustion, or the way the office light turned more intimate this late without anyone deciding it should. Today you trusted me, she said. I've trusted you since day 1. Is that true? Day 1 you thought I was a disaster. Day 1 I thought a lot of things I shouldn't have been thinking. Silence. Annie understood. She didn't need the sentence to go any further. Adrián picked up his jacket from the chair, put it on. He was going to leave. That was the right move. Gather his things, say thank you, walk out, put distance between them. Adrián stopped. He turned around, and Annie stood up and kissed him. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't tentative. It was the kiss of 2 people who had known exactly what this was for far too long, and were finally surrendering to it. He took exactly 1 second to react, a second she noticed, and would later describe as the moment a locked trunk finally gives way. Then he put a hand to her face and answered with that same intensity that defined him in everything else. When they pulled apart, they were both breathing differently than when the conversation had started. This shouldn't have happened, he said. Annie looked at him. Yeah, that line really kills the moment. Adrián let out something close to a sigh. Annie, I know. She picked up her bag, looked at him. Good night, Adrián. And she left. He stayed in the empty office, staring at the closed door, for a length of time he couldn't have measured. The next day, Annie arrived at 8:58, impeccable, professional, with the day's printed schedule and an expression she'd rehearsed mentally on the metro and believed was fairly convincing. Adrián arrived at 9:02, dark suit, tie perfectly knotted, the look of someone who'd slept well. Which was true for neither of them. He walked into his office. Annie brought him his coffee. Good morning. Good morning. You have a meeting at 10 with Mr. Castillo. Thank you. Lunch with the Herrero client at 2, to sign the final agreement. Perfect. And at 6, we can pretend we didn't kiss again, if you'd like. Adrián nearly choked on his coffee. It was a small, perfectly controlled reaction, but Annie saw it. At that exact moment, Marcus appeared in the doorway with a folder under his arm and a smile that suggested he'd been standing there longer than he should have. Interesting agenda, he said. Good morning, Marcus, Adrián said, in a voice that was exactly too normal. Good morning. Marcus looked at Annie. Good morning. Good morning. Annie picked up the tray. Excuse me. She left. Marcus walked into the office and closed the door. Adrián. No. I only wanted. No. As your best friend and partner, Marcus, I think. We have a meeting at 10. Marcus stared at him for 3 full seconds. Then he nodded, very slowly, with the solemnity of someone safeguarding a treasure. Meeting at 10. Perfect. He left, and in the hallway, he gave Marta a look that meant I'll tell you everything. Marta answered with a look that meant I already know. They tried. Credit where it's due. They tried. With a determination that under other circumstances would have been admirable. Monday. Annie arrived with her hair pulled back, unusual for her, and an almost aggressive efficiency. Folders delivered before he asked for them. The calendar reorganized without comment. One-word answers whenever he asked her anything that wasn't strictly work-related. Adrián, for his part, didn't leave his office all morning. Calls, files, silence. The door closed with a firmness Marta correctly read, as I am not emotionally available right now. The trouble started at 3 in the afternoon. Annie went to drop off a file and found him standing by the window, jacket off, looking out at the street. She walked in, set the folder on the desk, and turned to leave. He didn't turn around, but just as she reached the door, he said, Did you eat? A pause. Yes. Fine. Another silence. Annie left, and in the hallway, thought that fine, 2 letters, had sounded like something completely different from what it said. Tuesday was stranger. Adrián sent her every message by email, even though they were 6 feet apart. Annie replied by email with a formality that would have seemed perfectly normal, if both of them hadn't known what they knew. Marcus watched the email exchange from his office with the expression of someone watching a nature documentary. They're emailing each other, he told Marta at noon. I know. They're sitting 6 feet apart. And you knew? How long do you think they'll last? Marta considered the question. By Thursday. It happened on Wednesday. Adrián stepped out of his office to grab the Montiel file and nearly collided with Annie in the hallway. They both stopped, less than a foot apart. The hallway was narrow. Sorry, she said. No, sorry, he said. A silence of exactly 4 seconds. The Montiel file, Annie said. I left it on your desk. Right. I'll get it. Neither of them moved. Adrián. Annie, they spoke at the same time. They stopped at the same time. You first, she said. No, you. I was just going to say this is ridiculous. I was going to say uncomfortable. But ridiculous works too. A pause. I can't pretend it didn't happen, Adrián said. He said it quietly, with that same precision he used for everything. But I also can't act like it has no consequences. There's a difference in our positions that. I know, Annie said. I see it too. A pause. But pretending we don't know each other isn't the solution either, because it isn't working, and honestly, neither of us is doing a very good job of acting it. He looked at her. Something at the corner of his mouth shifted. What do you propose? That we're honest. No rush. Not deciding everything right now. A pause. Is that too unstructured for you? Adrián looked at her for a long moment. Yes, he said. But I'll try. At the next desk, Marta typed with her eyes fixed on her screen, though she'd stopped actually pressing keys about 3 minutes earlier. The first time was a Friday night. Adrián had a file that needed urgent review. Annie lived 12 minutes from the office. It was logical, from a purely practical standpoint, for him to drop it off in person and have her review it right there. The deadline was Monday. The file existed. That part was true. What was also true was that there were at least 4 more efficient ways to get that information to her without either of them needing to be in the same apartment on a Friday night. Neither of them mentioned that. He arrived with the file. She opened the door. The conversation about the Mendoza case lasted exactly 17 minutes, after which neither of them had much interest in him leaving. It wasn't only desire, although the desire was there, clear and undeniable, like the light in that small, warm apartment that smelled like something he couldn't have described, but that over the following days he found himself unconsciously searching for everywhere else. It was also the conversation. The way she laughed when he said something he hadn't meant to be funny. The way he listened without interrupting, without advising, just present, while she talked about her fears about Madrid, about work, about whether she'd ever measure up to a place that demanded so much. "And what if I'm not enough?" she said that night, staring at the ceiling. "Not work-wise, in general. What if I get all the way here, and it turns out I wasn't all that?" Adrián looked at her from where he was lying. "That's not going to happen." "How do you know?" "Because what you have isn't something you can learn. And what you don't have yet, you're learning faster than anyone expected, including me." Annie looked at him for a moment. Was that a compliment? It was an objective assessment. "With you, it's the same thing." He didn't answer, but he didn't leave. That night, there was no clear decision, no solemn declaration, no line crossed all at once. There was a pause that lasted too long. Annie's breathing changing as Adrián moved closer, his hand brushing her waist as if still asking permission, and the way she closed her eyes before touching his face. The file stayed open on the table, forgotten between 2 cups of cold tea, while the apartment seemed to shrink around them. Adrián kissed her with a restraint that didn't last long, because Annie answered with that mix of tenderness and courage that disarmed him more than any argument ever had. And after that, there was no boss, no assistant, no carefully worded professional caution, just the two of them, the warm lamplight, the sound of Madrid behind the window, and a silence full of breathing that said far more than any confession could. Afterward, everything was slower, more intimate, more real. Adrián discovered his hand could tremble while brushing the hair from her face, and Annie discovered that this rigidly structured man could become unbelievably gentle the moment he stopped guarding himself. There was no rush, just warmth where there had been distance, quiet laughter, the lingering trace of her perfume on his shirt, and that dangerous feeling that, for a few hours, the world had stopped demanding explanations from either of them. Annie fell asleep first, her hand resting near Adrián's heart. He didn't sleep right away. He lay there, listening to her breathing, understanding with a clarity that almost hurt that this hadn't been a mistake. If anything, the mistake had been believing, for so long, that he could live without ever feeling this again. Saturday morning, Adrián woke first. Madrid's light came in slanted through the window. Annie slept beside him with that particular stillness of someone truly resting, no guard up. He watched her for a length of time he couldn't have measured, and felt something he hadn't expected to feel. Not just desire, something closer to fear. Because he wanted to stay, and it had been 2 years since he'd wanted to stay anywhere. When she woke up, she found him sitting on the edge of the bed with coffee he'd made himself. He'd found the coffee maker on his own, which had taken him longer than he'd ever admit, and an expression she recognized immediately. "You have your complicated contract face on." "I'm thinking. I can see that. I'm worried it's about me." "It is." "Then think something nicer." He looked at her, and something in that exchange, that ridiculous, perfect line, made the fear ease back, just 1 millimeter. 1 millimeter was enough, for now. At the office, the following days were an exercise in concealment that would have fooled anyone, except the 2 people paying the closest attention. Marcus arrived on Monday and noticed that Adrián, who used to order his coffee with the same predictability as sunrise, hadn't ordered it yet by 10 in the morning. Then he noticed that when Adrián passed Annie in the hallway, he'd adjusted his path, minimally, almost imperceptibly, to avoid brushing against her, which was exactly what someone would do who normally didn't bother to avoid it. On Tuesday, Marcus called Adrián at 10 at night. No answer. On Wednesday, he tried again at 9:30. "I called you last night," he said Thursday in the hallway. "I was busy. I drove past your building. Saw Annie's car parked downstairs." There are a lot of cars like that in Madrid. It was hers. It had a keychain hanging from the mirror that said Vigo is non-negotiable. Silence. "That proves nothing, Adrián. It proves you're sleeping with your assistant, and that it's affecting your ability to argue. What's the part of all this that worries you the most?" Adrián looked at him. "This conversation isn't happening." "Completely agreed." Marcus nodded solemnly. "Is she good?" A pause shorter than Adrián would have liked. "Is she happy?" "Yes." "Good." Marcus clapped him on the shoulder. "Meeting at 11. Don't be late." The next day, Marta handed Adrián an envelope with the dry cleaning invoice and said, without looking at him, "Mr. Ibáñez, discretion is a virtue. But not wearing the same shirt 2 days in a row also helps." Adrián took the envelope, said nothing, but at the corner of his mouth, there was something that on someone else might have been called a smile. Diego Salvatierra was 29, had a doctoral thesis on procedural law he never seemed to finish, and was honest enough to admit that Annie Rivas was the most interesting person he'd met since starting at the firm. He wasn't the only one who thought so. He was just the only one who said it out loud. Got plans Friday? He asked one Wednesday at noon, by the coffee machine. There's a place in Malisana with live music. I thought maybe. Diego, just as coworkers, you don't have to. It's not that. It's just, I have something Friday. Saturday then. Annie hesitated. The hesitation was small, but noticeable. And Diego, who was more observant than he looked, caught it. No worries, he said, without changing his tone. We'll figure out another day. Annie nodded and left. And Diego stood there, looking at the coffee he hadn't ordered, thinking that the simplest explanation isn't always the most comfortable one. What neither of them knew was that Adrián had been in the kitchen down the hall the entire time, looking for a glass of water he had no particular need for. When Annie walked past his office at 6:15 that evening with her coat on, he stepped out. Annie, the Mendoza file. She stopped. What about it? I need us to go over it now. It's urgent. The hearing's in November. November comes fast. Annie looked at him. He held her gaze with a calm that would have convinced any courtroom. Adrián, are you trying to keep me from going out with Diego? I'm trying to prevent procedural errors. How romantic. A pause. The file can wait until tomorrow, he said finally. Already figured. Annie smiled, one of the small smiles she kept just for him. And I don't have plans with Diego, in case that's of interest to you. Adrián didn't answer. But when she left, it took him a moment longer than necessary to go back into his office. Side note, Diego wasn't a bad guy. He was simply the wrong man at the wrong time, watching the right person from the wrong place. In romantic comedies, that tends to have consequences. And it would here, too. Elena Vargas showed up at the office on a Tuesday in December, no appointment, which was a statement in itself. She was 34, with the kind of presence you develop after years of being the wife of a man who has presence of his own, tall, confident, well-dressed. There was an unresolved divorce matter, a shared property that had never been fully settled, and a new lawyer who'd suggested she speak with Adrián directly again. Adrián received her in his office with the same face he'd give any client. No visible reaction, courteous, efficient. Annie was at her desk when Elena walked by, and looked at her without knowing yet who she was. She found out 20 minutes later, when Marta told her with surgical neutrality. The woman in with Mr. Adrián is his ex-wife. In case you needed to know. Why would I need to know that? Marta didn't answer, which was, in itself, an answer. Annie kept working, or tried to, because there was something about how Adrián had closed his office door, harder than usual, barely noticeable, that told her something heavier than paperwork was happening in there. When Elena left, she walked past Annie's desk and looked at her with that quick, evaluating glance some people give without realizing they're giving it. You're the new assistant? Yes. A pause. Elena glanced toward Adrián's office, the door still closed. Always so predictable, surrounded by people who organize his life for him. She said it without apparent malice, which made it land harder. Take care of him. He needs it, even if he'd never say so. And she left. Annie stood in the hallway for a moment. Then she knocked softly on Adrián's door. Come in. She walked in. Adrián stood by the window, back to her, the posture he had when something had gotten to him, and he wasn't going to admit it. Are you okay? Yes, Annie. A pause. I didn't like how she talked about you. It doesn't matter. It does matter. She stepped closer. You don't have to tell me anything. But if you want to. I don't want to. A pause. He turned, looked at her. But thank you. Annie nodded, started to leave. At the door, she stopped. What hurt me most, he said, in that low, precise voice he used for hard truths, wasn't the infidelity. It was realizing I'd believed everything was settled, that the family side of things was solid, secure, and finding out that what I thought was structure was just appearance. That made me feel foolish. Not betrayed. Foolish. Annie looked at him for a moment. Someone should have told you sooner. That wasn't foolishness. That was faith. And it not being returned wasn't your fault. Adrián didn't answer. But something in his posture shifted, like a beam that had been carrying weight for too long had, just for a moment, found somewhere else to rest. Diego Salvatierra wasn't a bad person. That's worth repeating, because it matters. Here's what happened. One Wednesday morning, on his way to the office, Diego saw Annie leaving Adrián's building in Salamanca. He saw her because he lived 2 blocks away and walked that street every day. He saw her, her coat, her hair down, 8:15 in the morning, exchange that familiar little nod with the building's doorman, the kind of nod that comes from having been there before. Diego didn't say anything that day, or the next, but he was human, and he was confused. And the week before, he'd asked Annie out, and she'd hesitated in a way he hadn't understood. So at lunch with 2 junior associates, when someone asked about Ibáñez's new assistant, Diego said something he didn't mean as gossip, but it became one anyway. He said it without malice. He said it because he was confused and thought he was saying it in confidence. By the next day, the comment had spread through the office with the particular efficiency of things nobody should say, but everybody wants to hear. Annie found out from a co-worker in administration, who told her, "Because I thought you should know," with that poison generosity information sometimes carries. The exact line going around was, "The new assistant didn't get the job because of her resume." Annie spent 4 minutes in the bathroom. Then she came out, went to her desk, and worked the rest of the day with a focus indistinguishable from her usual focus. But that night, when Adrián called, she didn't answer. It was Marta who told Adrián, bluntly, the way she did everything. "There's a rumor going around about Miss Rivas." A pause. "About why you hired her?" Adrián looked at her. Something in his expression changed. "Who?" "It doesn't matter who. What matters is how it's handled." Marta looked at him. "And if you step in to defend her the wrong way, the damage will be worse." Adrián went to Annie's office and closed the door. "I know what's going around. I'm going to talk to HR, and—" "No." Annie looked at him. There were no tears. There was something harder than that. "Please, don't. I won't let you defend me as a boss, when both of us know that's not the whole truth. Don't save me. Respect me." He looked at her for a long moment. "What are you going to do?" "Prove I'm here because I'm good at this job." A small pause. "Because I am." Adrián nodded slowly, with the particular difficulty of someone who knows the right thing to do isn't always what he wants to do. "I know," he said. The Perez and Associates case was the biggest thing to come through the firm in 2 years, a multi-million-euro merger with 3 parties, 2 jurisdictions, and a 300-page contract the team had been reviewing for weeks. The night before the final meeting, while preparing the dossier, Annie found something, an exclusivity clause buried in Appendix D, page 187, written in language that looked standard, but which, read alongside Article 12.3 of the main contract, created a contradiction that automatically voided the non-compete guarantee the lead client had required as a condition of the deal. Nobody had caught it. 3 experienced lawyers, 2 rounds of team review, and nobody had caught it. Annie did. She went to Adrián's office at 7 that evening with the document marked up. "I need you to look at this." He read it once, twice, looked up. "When did you find this?" "An hour ago." "Tomorrow, in the meeting, you present it." "Adrián, I'm not." "You found it. You present it." A pause. "Can you?" Annie looked at him for a moment. "Yes." The next day, she walked into the room 20 minutes into the meeting. When the opposing counsel began explaining the terms of the non-compete guarantee, Annie raised her hand. Everyone looked at her. "Excuse me. There's a contradiction between the exclusivity clause in Appendix D and Article 12.3 of the main contract that directly affects that guarantee." One of the opposing lawyers started to speak. "Miss Rivas isn't finished," Adrián said, in that voice that allowed no interruption. The lawyer closed his mouth. Annie explained calmly, precisely, with exact page numbers and paragraphs. There was a silence. The lead client looked at Adrián. "Who is this woman?" "My assistant." A pause. "And the person who just saved you 2 million euros." From the other end of the table, Marcus watched Annie with an expression that, for those who knew him, was Marcus's version of genuine admiration. Marta, who wasn't in the room but was in the hallway when Annie came out, was waiting with 2 cups of tea. "Well done, kid." "Thanks, Marta. Now drink your tea, and don't say thank you. There's nothing to thank when you're just doing what you know how to do." Later, Adrián found her. "Annie, I want you to know, I never hired you because you were beautiful." A pause. "Which doesn't mean you're not. But that has nothing to do with what happened today." Annie looked at him. "I know," she said. And for the first time in weeks, she believed it completely. She made the decision on a Sunday morning, alone in her apartment, coffee in hand, looking out at the street. It wasn't that she didn't love him, it was exactly the opposite. The rumor had passed. The meeting had buried it better than any denial could have. But something had stayed behind. A question she couldn't silence. If anyone ever asked how she'd gotten where she was going to get, what would the story be? The assistant who turned out to be good, or the woman who slept with the boss? She didn't want her story to have that question at its center. Monday morning, she went to Adrián's office before anyone else arrived and left an envelope on his desk. Inside, a formal request for transfer to the mediation department, with carefully written, professional justifications. He read it when he came in and went to find her. Why? Because I need to know who I am at this firm without it depending on who I am to you. Annie, this isn't a rejection. I know. It's that I need to build this myself. If we do it backward, if we're together first, and then I try to prove I deserve to be here, there will always be someone who says the order matters. Adrián looked at her for a long moment, long enough that she braced herself for him to say something to talk her out of it. But he didn't. Okay, he said, in that low, precise voice. I support you, Annie. She blinked. That's it. What did you want me to say? I don't know. Something that made this harder. That wouldn't be respecting what you're asking for. She looked at him, and in that moment understood something she'd been missing for a while, that a man who truly respected her looked exactly like this. Not easy, not comfortable, just real. That night, Marcus found Adrián in his office, the transfer request still on the desk. You approved it? Yes. Before, when someone left, you used to lock the door behind them. I know. Now you could try opening it and going after her. I don't want to pressure her. I didn't say pressure her. I said be brave. Those are different things, even if to you they feel equally uncomfortable. Adrián looked at him. When did you get wise? I'm a founding partner of a successful law firm. I was always wise. You just never asked. 3 weeks passed. Annie settled into the mediation department, which turned out to be exactly where her emotional intelligence found its best version. She mediated between parties who couldn't hear each other with a skill that raised eyebrows in the first 2 weeks and earned the department's respect by the third. Adrián saw her in the hallways, in general meetings, over morning coffee, always from a distance. And every time their eyes met, there was an entire conversation neither of them was having out loud. 3 weeks. Long ones. One January night, the office was empty. It was 8:30. Adrián had been reviewing a contract that didn't need urgent review, but it gave him a reason to be there once everyone else had gone. Annie walked through the hallway, coat on, heading for the exit. He stepped out of his office. Annie. She stopped, turned around. The hallway was silent. Madrid, outside. There's something I want to tell you. He stepped closer, not far, just enough. Not as your boss. Not as a partner of the firm. As the man who spent 3 weeks trying to find the right way to say this without it sounding like I'm trying to convince you of anything. Annie listened, perfectly still. I don't want you to come back as my assistant. A pause. I want you to come back, if you want, as a lawyer, as a partner someday, as whatever you decide to be. But I don't want to hide you. I don't want to pretend you're an administrative mistake in my life. And I don't want to keep passing you in the hallway, knowing what I know and not saying it. Silence. What do you know? She asked, in a voice smaller than usual. That you matter to me. He said it with that same precision he reserved for things that cost him something. That for months, you've been the reason I want to stay somewhere, when staying is the thing I've been running from for 2 years. A pause. That you are, in all likelihood, the most impossible person to ignore I have ever met in my life, and that I've tried. Quite a bit. Annie almost made a joke. He caught the flicker of it cross her face, but this time, she didn't. Adrián. That was almost romantic. For a man who talks like an NDA. He looked at her, and this time, he really smiled. The kind of smile Marta would have filed away for its rarity. I love you, Annie. The smile left her face. The joke left her. The defenses left her, because he, a trunk with no key, had just opened himself completely. And she crossed the hallway and hugged him. Not dramatically, no big gestures. She hugged him the way you hug someone you've wanted to hug for a long time, and finally can. He held her back with both arms, and kept her there, in that empty hallway of the Salamanca office, for as long as it took. 1 year later, epilogue. Ibáñez and Arenas was still in Salamanca. The bronze sign was still discreet. The working silence was still the same. Almost everything else had changed in ways that were invisible from the outside, but that everyone inside the office noticed. Annie Rivas was now the most requested mediator in the department. She had her own small office, with a plant in the corner and a photo of Vigo on her desk, and 2 active cases that, a year earlier, would have gone to lawyers with twice her experience. Her mother had come to visit in October and spent 3 days looking at Madrid with the same mix of pride and disorientation Annie had felt when she first arrived. Marta was still the queen of the place. Her spreadsheet of Marcus's women had grown to 42 entries. There was a new column. Could this be the one? Every cell said no, except the last one, which said pending evaluation. It was the only time in 12 years Marta had ever left something unresolved. Marcus Arenas was still Marcus, though something was different that year. A little quieter. A little more present in the conversations that mattered. As if he'd started learning something he couldn't quite name yet. And Adrián Ibáñez still arrived at the office at 9:02. Exactly as always. But now, when he crossed the hallway toward his office, he sometimes turned his head toward the mediation wing. And if Annie's door was open and she looked up, he'd give a small nod. In his particular vocabulary, that nod meant, "Good morning, and I'm glad you're here," along with a few other things that didn't translate directly into legal language. One Tuesday in November, Marcus arrived for a partners meeting and found Adrián looking at his phone with an expression that wasn't his work face. "Annie, yeah, you used to be scary. Now you're just adorable." "It's worse," Marcus said, sitting down. "In case you didn't know." Marta walked in with the day's agenda and a folder. "And you, don't talk, Mr. Marcus. You have dinner at 9 tonight, and this time, you're buying the flowers yourself. Not from the airport." Marcus looked at Adrián. "Love has destroyed this firm." "No," Adrián said. "It's made it more profitable." At that moment, Annie appeared in the conference room doorway with a file under her arm. "Am I interrupting?" "Never," said Marcus. "Always," said Adrián, at the same time. And then, watching her laugh, added, "Come in." 3 weeks later, in Adrián's apartment, there was a dinner he'd planned with the kind of attention to detail that would have sufficed for an international merger contract. Candles, music, the right wine, the flowers in exactly the right vase, and a 3-paragraph speech he'd written and rewritten 4 times. Annie arrived at 8:30, saw all of it, looked at him. "What is this?" "Dinner, Annie. A dinner with context." She laughed, that laugh that, even a year later, still changed the whole feel of the office whenever it happened. And in that moment, laughing, she noticed his hand was shaking slightly around the wine glass. "You're shaking." "No, Annie. A little." She looked at him with the expression she got when she understood something he hadn't said yet. "Are you going to sue me, or propose to me?" Adrián set the glass down, reached into his pocket, and got down on one knee. The 3-paragraph speech stayed in his pocket. What came out instead was this: "That depends on your answer." Annie laughed again, and cried at the same time, which is the specific combination reserved for the things that matter most. "Yes," she said. "Yes. Of course yes." Adrián Ibáñez, who for 2 years had been a trunk with no key, stood up and held her. And Madrid stayed out there, indifferent as always. But inside that apartment in Salamanca, something that had been locked away for a very long time was now, finally, irreversibly, open. The next day, Annie walked into the office with a ring on her left hand and an expression so bright that Marta knew before she even looked at her fingers. Marcus saw it 3 minutes later. He froze in the middle of the hallway, a folder in one hand, a coffee in the other. "No." Annie raised her hand, smiling. "Yes." Marcus looked at Adrián like he'd just uncovered corporate treason. "And you didn't call me?" "It was 11 at night. You're my best friend. You're also dramatic at any hour." Marcus put a hand to his chest, as if taking that as a compliment. Then he looked at Annie, threw his arms open, and hugged her with such exaggerated emotion he nearly wrinkled her jacket. "Officially welcome to the hardest part of this firm. The marriage. Putting up with Adrián when he thinks he's right." Marta walked past them without lifting her eyes much. "Then it'll be a long marriage, sweetheart." And it was. The wedding wasn't big. Annie didn't want a room full of people she couldn't hug one by one. And Adrián, though he'd never admitted in those words, didn't want to share that day with anyone who hadn't lived through everything it had taken to get there. It was an intimate ceremony at a country house outside Madrid. White flowers, soft music, a long table under warm lights. Annie's mother cried from the moment she saw her appear. Marta cried once, quietly, and then claimed it was allergies. Marcus cried with absolutely no discretion whatsoever, and then said it was because the pollen count that day was criminal. When Annie walked toward Adrián, he looked at her the way he had that first afternoon in the interview, but with one difference. He wasn't trying to hide anything anymore. And when she reached his side, she whispered, "Are you sure about this, Mr. Ibáñez?" Adrián took her hand. "I have never drafted a better contract in my life." Annie laughed, and that laugh, once again, opened every window. 3 years later, Adrián's apartment no longer looked like it belonged to a man who lived alone with his case files. There were toys in the living room. Many toys. Too many toys. A race car track had occupied the center of the living room for 4 days, because nobody had had the physical, emotional, or logistical courage to take it apart. Beside the sofa stood a stuffed giraffe nearly as tall as Annie. In the corner, a little red plastic car waited its turn, as if it had a permanent parking spot. And under the dining table sat a giant box of building blocks that, according to Marcus, were educational. Though so far they'd only managed to make Adrián step on a blue piece at 6 in the morning and say a word Annie pretended not to hear. The person responsible for all of it was 2 years old. He had Annie's eyes, Adrián's focused seriousness whenever he tried to fit impossible pieces together, and an absolute devotion to Marcus Arenas. His name was Mateo, though Marcus insisted the boy had been calling him uncle with exceptional clarity since he was 11 months old. Annie's official version was that for several months, Mateo had only said things that sounded vaguely like yo, tato, and mo. Marcus accepted any of the three as sufficient legal proof of unconditional love. Tio, Mateo shouted one afternoon, running for the door the moment the doorbell rang. From the sofa, Adrián closed his eyes. No. Annie came out of the kitchen, drying her hands on a towel. Adrián, brace yourself, he's bringing something big. I know. You don't know that. The doorbell rang again. Marcus stood on the other side with an enormous box wrapped in shiny paper and a smile that would worry any responsible adult. My favorite nephew. Mateo screamed with joy. Adrián looked at the box. Marcus, before you say anything, it's educational. Last time you said that, and it was a 3-story garage with lights. He learned cause and effect. He learned to honk a siren at 6:30 in the morning. That's also cause and effect. Annie walked over and looked at the box. What is it? Marcus lifted his chin proudly. A professional kid's kitchen set. Silence. Adrián looked at him. He's 2. Exactly. Vocations should be discovered early. We don't have room for it. That's what they said about the racetrack. And look how that turned out. Adrián looked at the track, which took up half the living room, blocked access to the balcony, and had forced every adult in the house to walk sideways for 4 days. Marcus, that track has changed the entire traffic pattern of this apartment. Family life requires adaptation. Annie tried not to laugh. She failed. Mateo was already pounding on the box with both hands. Tio, open. Marcus looked at Adrián with absurd solemnity. Sorry. Direct order from my client. Your client is 2 years old and more persuasive than most of our actual clients. Adrián rubbed a hand over his face, but he was already smiling. That was the thing that had changed the most. Not the apartment, not the office, not the schedule. Him. The man who used to measure life in case files, schedules, and silences, now sat on the living room floor, sleeves rolled up, trying to assemble a toy kitchen while his son handed him plastic screws and Marcus offered opinions without helping. That goes the other way, Marcus said. Marcus, I'm just trying to contribute. Then contribute silence. Annie sat on the sofa with a cup of tea, watching the scene with a tenderness that still surprised her with its size. Adrián on the floor, Mateo on his leg, Marcus fighting with a bag of pieces, the racetrack running through the living room like an impossible highway, the giant giraffe watching over it all from the corner. Family, she thought. Not perfect. Not orderly. Not quiet. Family. Mateo stopped helping his father and ran to Annie with a block in his hand. Mama. She picked him up and kissed his cheek. Yes, my love. Mateo pointed at Marcus. Tio crazy. Marcus froze. Adrián ducked his head to hide his laugh. Annie didn't bother hiding hers. Very good, Mateo. Marcus said, beaming. First correct psychological assessment. Don't encourage that, Adrián said. He's brilliant. 2 years old, and he already reads people, just like his mother. Annie looked at Adrián. He looked back at her. There was something in that look she knew very well. Good morning. I'm glad you're here. Thank you for staying. Thank you for opening the door. Thank you for messing up my life until it became livable. Mateo wriggled down and ran back to the box. Open, Papa. Adrián sighed, defeated and happy. Yes, boss. Marcus put a hand to his chest. That was beautiful. The kid already runs this family. He gets it from Marta, Annie said. As if summoned, Marcus's phone rang. It was Marta. He answered on speaker. Marta, I'm in the middle of a family emergency. If the emergency is another excessive gift for Mateo, may I remind you that the child's parents no longer have physical space to keep storing your displays of affection. Marcus looked at Adrián. Did you call her? No. Annie raised her hand. I did. Betrayal, Marcus said. Marta continued, unbothered. Also, you have a meeting at 9 tomorrow. Don't be late because you were busy assembling other people's toys. They're not other people's. He's my nephew. They are domestic obstacles, Mr. Marcus. Hearing the voice, Mateo toddled over to the phone. Marta, there was a silence on the other end. Marcus's eyes went wide. Did you hear that? Marta took a second. I heard perfectly. He said Marta. Adrián corrected. He said Marta. Marcus repeated. Clearly, Marta's voice came back, softer, though she tried to hide it. Good afternoon, Mateo. Mateo smiled at the phone. Tio crazy. Adrián burst out laughing. Annie too. Marcus opened his mouth, indignant. On the other end, Marta said nothing for 2 seconds. Then, the child shows promise. And hung up. That night, when Mateo finally fell asleep, the toy kitchen sat assembled in the middle of the living room. Next to the racetrack, the giant giraffe, and a row of little cars Mateo had parked in front of the sofa, according to a logic only he understood. Annie turned off the living room lights and found Adrián by the window, Mateo asleep in his arms. The image stopped her. Adrián, the man who had been a trunk with no key, held his son with a gentleness that seemed to contradict everything the world had ever believed about him. Mateo slept with one hand gripping the collar of his father's shirt. Annie walked over slowly. Don't you want to put him in the crib? Adrián looked at the boy. In a minute. Annie smiled. You said that 20 minutes ago. It's still technically a pending minute. She rested her head on his shoulder. For a while, neither of them said anything. Madrid stayed out there with its lights, its traffic, its rush, and its metro lines capable of confusing anyone. Inside, the apartment was a mess, full of toys, invisible crumbs, pieces that would keep turning up under furniture for months, and Adrián wouldn't have changed a single thing about it. You know, Annie said quietly, when I showed up late to that interview, I thought I'd ruined my life. Adrián looked at her. Technically, you disordered it. Oh great. Much better. Much, much better. He smiled. Do you regret hiring me? Adrián looked at Mateo, then at the living room, overrun with impossible gifts. Then at Annie. Every day. She gave him a soft punch on the arm. He smiled. Of not having hired you sooner. Annie stared at him with that sudden wave of emotion that, even after all these years, could still leave her without a comeback. Adrián leaned his forehead against hers, Mateo asleep between them. Thank you for being late, Annie whispered. She closed her eyes. Thank you for hiring me anyway. And in that apartment in Salamanca, between a racetrack nobody knew how to take apart, a toy kitchen that didn't fit anywhere, and a little boy who had turned Marcus Arenas into the most over-the-top uncle in Madrid, the trunk with no key no longer existed. It had been replaced by something far more dangerous, an open home, a family, and a life that, for the first time, Adrián Ibáñez didn't want to control. He just wanted to live it.